Welcome to the Demeere podcast. We talk about martial arts, self-defense, and a whole lot more. And now your host, Demeere.
Hello everybody, welcome to episode 29 of the podcast. Now as always, a huge shout out to one of my patrons, and that is Daniel Pitar. Daniel, I hope I pronounced that correctly. Daniel's been one of my patrons for quite a while now, and I just want to say thanks to Daniel for supporting me, all my work, the podcast, the blog, the videos, everything that I do. And it's thanks to Daniel and my other patrons that I can do that. So huge shout out to you, Daniel, and obviously anybody else. If you want to join me on Patreon and actually get access to a bunch of unique content that you cannot get elsewhere, very simple. Go to patreon.com/Wim Demeere, my name, and then you can just check it out there. There's something for everybody at any level of support that you want to give. Everything is very much appreciated. That is the first thing that I wanted to say. And then a little bit of housekeeping before we go on to the main topic of the podcast. So first of all, I know it's been a while since I had my last podcast, and that's basically all my fault, obviously. It's just been a huge roller coaster of a ride, lots of stuff going on in my personal life, and just really crazy, hectic. And it's been quite difficult to get everything, just get enough time to prepare the podcast and then obviously record it, and then edit it and so on. It takes quite a bit of time. So that was quite difficult. And also, to be honest about it, I was a little bit getting burned out, just working a lot and trying to finish the boxing book, and talk about that in a second. And it was getting a little bit much just to consistently get some quality content out, as opposed to just dialing it in and just trying to make podcast episodes like, right, got one filled, done, forget about it, as opposed to try to give you something that is worth listening to. So I took a little bit of a break from that while I focused on everything else that was going on. And I'm happy to say that it helped me recharge a little bit. So that was very much needed. And now I can get right back to it. So that is the first thing. Now, moving on to the second piece of housekeeping, and that is what's going on with the Boxing for Self-Defense book. Drum roll, please. After much work and delays, also because of life intervening, that one is finally finished, and I'm busy editing right now. What does that mean? That means that the first draft is completely done, that everything that I want to write is in it, and then I am now revising, rewriting, editing, and so on, meaning trying to catch typos, if there's something that should be written a little bit easier or simpler, changing the sentence structure a little bit, just all that basic editing stuff that needs to get done before something is ready for print. And I am making good progress with that. It's quite difficult this time. I don't know why. I think I've developed my writing style. It obviously changes throughout time, as with anybody who writes. That's the case with me as well. So I found that it's been quite difficult to streamline my writing a little bit more, because I noticed that I was waxing poetic in many places where I was like, right, Wim, this is an instructional book. Don't make it too complicated. Just simplify, which means rewriting and also cutting a lot of words. So I've been doing that. That's going, it's advancing well. Takes a bit of work, but it's advancing right well. And I hope to finish that soon. And then when that one is finished, I can send it off to copy editor and then add the pictures. And then it should be relatively quickly to get it to publication. Now, I'm going to try to do it a little bit differently this time. What I'd like to do is make sure that both the ebook and the print version is available right away. And as you guys know, if I do that, that means that I have to wait for the print proof to get to me. That means that I publish with Amazon in the Kindle Direct program, and that means that they have to ship a print proof to me, a paper version. I have to really go over that with a fine-tooth comb and see if there are not any printing errors, if everything aligns correctly, if the cover is correct, if they didn't misalign the picture, and all this kind of technical stuff. The main hurdle with that is the time it takes for them to ship it to me, because it comes from over the ocean, so it's printed in the US, has to get to me to Belgium, and then I have to review it. And that just takes a while for the post to get it to me. So once that is done, I can hit the publish button and it should go live very, very soon after that. So if you want to stay notified, and I'm just going to send you to wimdemeere.com/notification. It's an easy sign up, just your name and email. Then you will get an email from the company that I use to send out all the notifications. And you just have to confirm. If you don't find it, check your spam filter. I know that it gets stuck there sometimes. You have to click that you agree and then you're done. The only thing I do is send you an email when I have a new book or video out, and if I do a promotion or a discount or anything along those lines. So that typically means that you get maybe 2 or 3 emails a year from me. That's about it. So low volume and no spam, because I do not sell my email list to anybody. So that's it for this part. So again, I hope to wrap up the final edits of the Boxing for Self-Defense book, hopefully very, very soon. And then I will keep you guys up to date on that front. So that's one thing. And then we're going to go into the main topic of this podcast, and that is, which podcasts do I listen to? It changes every now and then, and some podcasts stay with me and others I do not really keep on following anymore. It's only normal because, as you know, everybody is going to do a podcast for his own reasons. And the result is that sometimes people change, in the sense that their interests change, or they have something going on in their life and that changes them, and so on. And as a result, what happens is that they start podcasting about something else. As a result from that, well, you or I may not be interested in it anymore. And as a result from that, you either stop listening or you go to the next podcast that they start, which is also something that happens with podcasters. They start more than one. I'm no different. I would love to have the time to start a podcast about mixed martial arts, because I'm an MMA teacher as well. Whereas this podcast here focuses on martial arts and self-defense and all the stuff related to that. So I keep the MMA stuff out of this podcast. But I'm just as passionate about combat sports as I am about this, but I don't have the time for it. So I know a lot of podcasters do that. So you have to sometimes follow the people that you like to listen to and see what else they're up to, or maybe come back to listening to them after not following them for a year or so, or a couple of months, because people change. I've noticed that with many podcasts that they just very slowly start bringing in specific types of guests, or start to focus more on certain topics, and then that becomes the main thing. Whereas when you first listened to them maybe a few years ago, then it was about slightly different topics. And all that is normal. Same thing is what happens with authors. They write books and you like them, and then all of a sudden they start writing different kinds of books and you don't like them anymore. It's fine. The really cool part is that podcasts are 99.99% totally free. So it doesn't cost you anything but your time, and you can stop at any time. So that is pretty much just a little bit of background as to how I work with podcasts, and that's kind of the way that I view things. Now, you don't have to if you're like, right, nope, I want people to always do the exact same thing and give me the exact same content that I love. Well, good luck with that. I'm not quite sure if that's going to work, but yeah, you can give it a try. Moving on. So first things first, I used an app called Podcast Addict, which I will put a link to in the show notes. And it's just an easy app that I have on my smartphone. I have an Android smartphone, and it's quite practical. There's a huge amount of apps. A lot of people who have Apple phones use iTunes, whatever works for you. But I like the Podcast Addict app. It's quite functional, quite practical, and it gives me an immediate overview of everything that I have as far as podcast content that I'm following. So I have different kinds. I'm not going to mention all of them. I am going to mention the ones that are relevant to the topics that I tend to discuss. So what am I listening to mostly? Well, first things first, gotta give props to the master, and that is the Joe Rogan Experience. Now, most of you know Joe Rogan as the commentator of UFC events, but he's a high-level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, started with Taekwondo. I think he was a Taekwondo champion as well. Stand-up comedian also is pretty much his main job, and he started his podcast just for fun. And the end result is that that's now pretty much one of the things he's mostly known for. It's pretty much the biggest podcast on the planet. I mean, he has millions of people listening to him. And I'm just checking one of the things you can do on the Podcast Addict app is see how many subscribers somebody has. And I just checked here, and he has 1.5 million subscribers in the Podcast Addict app. So that's not his total audience. That's just a part of it, just to give you an idea of how huge a platform he has. Now, why do I listen to it? Well, a bunch of things. What I really, really like is that, and some people hate Joe for that, but I kind of like it, is that they say that he's just, he always talks to his guests and kind of follows them along as if he doesn't have an opinion on his own. And then he has a guest who says white, and he says, yeah, great, yeah, interesting. And then next week he might have a guest who says black on the same subject. And people say, oh, well, yeah, then Joe follows them along as well. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, one of the things that I like to do with my podcast interviews with guests is not make them confrontational, because I'm not a journalist. I'm not out to dig out some truth that somebody thinks that needs to be discovered. I just want to have conversations with people that I find interesting, that I can learn something, and then the trick is that I let everybody, you guys, listen along with that conversation. So that is what I like to do, and I don't have anything to win. There's no points to score. There's no match you can win. There's no cup you get at the end of the match. That's not a part of the way that I view things. And I get the feeling that Joe is very much like that. So as a result, I kind of enjoy that he has this mindset of just talking to people. Now, every now and then, that kind of backfires a little bit. And I understand why. And the latest one was when he had an episode where he interviewed Jack Dorsey, so the CEO of Twitter. A lot going on with Twitter and social media, lots of criticism and so on. And apparently Joe got a huge amount of flack for that, because loads of listeners thought that he wasn't being critical enough to Jack Dorsey, and he let him get away with basically, not really answering the more important questions. And they said that Joe kind of needed to be, a little bit more confrontational. I get that. I get why, especially because it's such a hot button topic for most people nowadays. But here's the thing, and that's what I really appreciate what Joe did. He says, right, okay, I take this criticism to heart, and Jack Dorsey has already agreed to come back to the show, and we are going to ask him a couple of more difficult questions. You got a question you want me to ask him, put him in the comments on his social media channels, and I'm sure he's going to do that. So that's what I kind of like about the whole way that he approaches it, which is just talking to people who are from all kinds of fields. Now, what you get is a lot of comedians, stand-up comedians. That's Joe's main profession, I guess. So he likes to invite a bunch of stand-up comedians. I typically don't listen to those episodes. More often than not, I don't find them interesting. But that's just me. I like to listen to stand-up comedy when they perform. I found that I don't very much enjoy a lot of the stuff that they talk about when they're on Joe's podcast. So, that's one thing. One of the other things that Joe tends to do is invite guests who kind of have this special kind of experience. There was a journalist who was kidnapped by Somali pirates, and he was a prisoner for years. That was one of the guests that was very interesting what he had to say. He just recently had a retired Navy SEAL on, who is also a wingsuit world record holder. Now, if you don't know what a wingsuit is, that's kind of like people who try to imitate a flying squirrel. They have this bodysuit on, which has some flaps between the arms and legs and so on, and then they jump off a building or off a mountain, and they just float through the sky, and then they eventually hopefully pull a parachute. Interesting thing that they talked about is that, for instance, I think it was 60 people who were involved with all the advancements in developing good wingsuits and making progress so that they work better, so that you control your flight better, and so on. And the guest said, right, all 60 of those people are dead. They all died developing that technology. So bunch of very extreme kind of experienced guests that were on there as well. Another type of guest that he often gets is either entrepreneurs or scientists. I find that very interesting as well. One of the things that I love to listen to is people who are either very knowledgeable or even better, experts in a certain field. And then they just talk about their field. They don't try to beat you to death with how smart they are. They just explain, right, okay, so this is what it's like. It's very, very hard to get access to those kinds of people. That is also one of the things I like to do on my podcast. And just this is the quick announcement. So the following episode, next episode, will release in about 2 weeks. And I did an interview with Dr. Alexis Arswell, who is one of the specialists when it comes to handling deadly force encounters, in particular for law enforcement. And had a great interview with her about an hour and a half. She gives lots of really good information and feedback. Got to ask her a bunch of questions that my patrons wanted to hear. And in an other life, I would never have access to just having the chance to talk to her. And that's the kind of thing that Joe offers as well in his podcasts, which I like very much, is that you get pretty much, I think Joe has episodes about 4 or 5 a week. So he's very, very regular with it. It's kind of his day job almost, I guess. And you just hear people who are really smart and extremely well trained and experienced in a given field talk about it. And very often it's in a way that you and I can, I'm not going to say understand, but you can at least more or less follow the conversation. And sometimes it's wild topics. One of the wilder episodes was when Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla, was on, and obviously, if you follow the news, that was kind of interesting. Where they drank whiskey, he smoked a joint, and then let's say that the board of Tesla was not very happy with his performance, to quote Georges St-Pierre. So that kind of stuff happens. But there also was an episode, I'm blanking on the name of the guests. I think it was 2 guests, and it was about this very weird kind of not really a virus. I think it was prions, which is if you look up Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, which is something that is found in cows, mad cow's disease, and so on. And it was something going on, the same style of thing going on with deer and elk and so on, and that it's spreading throughout the United States. It's already been spread. It's already very much prevalent in, I think it's Norway or Sweden, I'm not sure, where they actually just killed off all the deer. The military shot them all, and that nobody gets to go in that area for years because it's so easy to spread that problem. A topic that I hadn't even heard of. I had heard about the Scandinavian pretty much slaughter of the deer, but I didn't know the full details. And that was a really interesting podcast episode. So in that regard, I would very much recommend Joe's podcast. What I don't listen to is the Fight Companions. This is pretty much Joe as a commentator on UFC events. He doesn't do all of them, obviously, but what he does is for some episodes, he just has a bunch of his buddies come over. They watch the event live, and then they just talk and comment and react with surprise and shock and so on, depending on what happens. I usually don't watch them for the main reason that if it's Joe and somebody else talking, that's usually fine. If there's a third person, it gets to be a little bit difficult to follow. But the last one, it was Joe. He had Eddie Bravo, his jiu-jitsu coach, Brian Carlin, who's also a stand-up comedy guy and an actor now, and Brendan Schaub, who is a former UFC fighter and also does stand-up comedy and also has his own podcast. 4 people talking through each other, and it's just, that doesn't interest me anymore. I mean, it's kind of like the boys hanging out and we get to listen to that. But if it's hard to keep track of who's saying what, then, I give up. So Joe Rogan podcast. Again, I will put all the links to all the podcasts in the show notes, and you just go to wimsblog.com/29. So the number 29, wimsblog.com/29, and you'll find the links there. So that is the first one. Now, next one that I like to listen to is Talking to Savages. Talking to Savages is a podcast by Randy King and Ryan Rodder, and I was actually a guest on that podcast a while ago. And you can, I'll put the link in the show notes. Very interesting. Randy has a very similar approach to what I like to listen to. He usually has a guest on, could be a variety of people. And it's mostly obviously people who have some sort of martial arts background, self-defense background, or have been a violence professional for a while. And again, they just talk. They just talk. So before I go on, I have to mention that. So Joe Rogan's episode, they can last up to 3 hours. So it could be an hour and a half, could be 3 hours. So that's long form. And Randy's podcast episode tend to be between about an hour, sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less. Has a few shorter episodes, but mostly you have to count about an hour. So again, one of the things that I like is that Randy tries to invite people who may not be like big names in the industry or whatever, but they're interesting people nonetheless. For instance, one of the episodes I really liked was the one with Maya Soderholm. Maya is a teacher of Filipino martial arts, and she's extremely skilled, and one of and if I'm not mistaken, she is what we call the banner bearer of her lineage, the style that she learned from her teacher, which means that she's the one that the teacher kind of lets take over when he's no longer there. And unfortunately, her teacher passed away a while ago, Sonny Umpat. So a very, very interesting episode, very interesting teacher. I very much recommend everybody just check out what Maya has to offer, and just a bunch of just a really cool interview and very interesting. Bunch of other people there as well. Somebody that I had on my show as well, Clint Overland, a friend of mine, extremely impressive violence professional. But then we have a bunch of other people as well on there. Somebody I also like, Coach Jeff Berger, who's an interesting guy as well. And again, that's some interesting stories. Some of them were pretty wild. And that's what I would recommend if you start listening to Randy's podcast. Is like, right, you're going to get to listen to people who come from all walks of life, who have vastly different life experience from whatever you or I have in our lives. Sometimes there'll be some overlap and similarities, and in many cases you'll go like, wow, what am I listening to here? What kind of person is this? And what kind of crazy life have they been living? And in other times it's just somebody who's very much specialized and very skilled in some particular area when it comes to self-defense or martial arts and so on. And it just makes for interesting listening. One of the most fun parts of the podcast that I think is the icebreaker questions that Randy and Ryan ask, which is just a bunch of questions that are a little bit, how should I put it, interesting to listen to the answers that the guests come up with. So again, Randy's podcast, Talking to Savages, very much one that I would recommend you listen to. Give it a try. Rand is how did you say that? He's very enthusiastic, so that means that it's a high energy show to listen to, so you have to be warned that that's going to happen. So that's one thing. Now, moving on to the next one that I like to listen to, and a little bit, you might think that this one is strange. It's Dan Carlin's Hardcore History podcast. Now, this is a professionally produced podcast. It's really, really impressive, and it's all about history. Now, I got involved listening to this podcast when I started listening to his series called Blueprint for Armageddon. And that is just hours and hours of professionally produced material. I'm just looking at, there are six parts to that. and every part is at least 3.5 hours long, up to 4 hours, 4 hours and a half. And it is just a lot of detailed information about World War One, and it's extremely detailed. Now, there are two reasons why I listen to that. I believe that, as most of you know, history tends to repeat itself, and it's by studying history that you can understand our current reality better. It also helps understand why certain events tend to happen, because they are rooted in the conflicts of the past, and they come just roaring back to life for many people out of the blue. But if you know your history, then you can, I wouldn't say predict what's going to happen, but you can see that why a certain issue would be a lot more problematic than a lot of people who do not know history would think, because they do not see the full context, that they don't see the nuances that are involved when it comes to all those different things. And that is one of the reasons why I very much like Dan Carlin's podcast, because it's extremely well documented. I mean, he does a lot of research trying to just give you a lot of details. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect is that he tends to link things together. It's a little bit hard to follow if you don't think that way, but he goes off on tangents that then later on tie into something that he was actually already explaining to you. And it's just detailed parts of history, but it all ties together. There's like a red thread that goes through all the different episodes, and that lets you just almost experience what it's like to be there. And that brings me to the real point why I like his podcast so much, and that's because he is a born storyteller. He's an incredibly talented storyteller. The way that he uses cadence and speech and emotions and so on to just bring you as if you're there on the battlefield in World War One and so on. It's quite, very, very impressive. There's that. It's not just about World War One. There's a bunch of different ones. The one that I'm listening to right now is called Supernova in the East, which is the Asia Pacific War. That is what that one is talking about. So very much recommended. If you are a student of history, I think you'll very much enjoy it. If you are not a student of history, I would suggest becoming one, because it's one of the best things you can do to understand the world we live in. And that brings me to the next podcast, and that one's called Tides of History. Now, that is one of the Wondery podcasts. So Tides of History, again, really, really good podcast as well, obviously about history. It is narrated and produced by Patrick Wyman. Patrick Wyman, who is a mixed martial arts practitioner, used to be on another podcast that I will mention in a bit. And he's a historian. And one of the things that I like that he does is that he's basically talking about just loads of stuff. But he had a huge part of his podcast was about the Roman Empire and the fall of the Roman Empire. But then he's working his way through history and going towards the Middle Ages and so on. And we are now at the point of that we're talking about the rise and fall of the Burgundy Empire. Well, the Marie of Burgundy was the last episode, I think, which is interesting for me because this is talking about things that happened where I live. So Marie of Burgundy, that was amongst other places. She was in Ghent. Ghent is a city which is about 45 minutes from where I live. So it's my local history for a large part. Not everything, but for a large part. Now, why is this interesting? Same reasons as the Dan Carlin podcast, because if you don't understand history, you're bound to make the mistakes from the past again. But the part that I find really fascinating is that not everybody agrees with that approach. But what I like is that what Patrick Wyman does is he tries to bring it to life. So, for instance, for some of the episodes that he does, he did that in particular with the parts about Roman history. He kind of made a composite character, basically, that is, for instance, a soldier in the legions in Rome, and basically they used different sources that give you of different people and different events, and they use those combined together to create basically what would be an average soldier in the legions at that time. Because we do not have full records, obviously, in particular of everyday people like you and me and what their lives were like back then. So what he does is draw from all those different sources and make that composite that gives you, hopefully, a relatively interesting and accurate portrayal of what it was like to be a Roman soldier or just an average peasant in medieval times and so on, and what their lives were like. Very interesting. One of the reasons why is that I like it is because it helps you put things into context, and it also gives a lot more nuance than what you learned in history books when you were in high school or and so on. When you learn history, but very often it's only a very sanitized and limited version of everything that happened in the past. Same reason it inspires our politics nowadays. So many people have this distorted vision of the past, and they don't really know the past very well. And as a result, they have certain assumptions, and they think that they need to change the world because of those assumptions. But if you actually go look at, well, what was it like in the past, it gives a very different picture. And logic would say that you're then going to adjust your current worldview. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't do that, but you need to have that information to begin with. And that's why I like the Tides of History podcast, because it gives quite a good bit of information about historical times, and in many cases it's just about regular folks. Sure, there are a bunch of episodes about the powers that be, the kings and the nobles and so on, who were the movers and shakers back throughout history, and that is equally interesting. But I very much like the episodes where it's about normal life. And one of the really cool things that he did was actually he had a guest on, and I'm blanking on the name, but it was I think also a fellow historian, and they basically took Game of Thrones and compared it to the late medieval politics and what was going on then, and actually talk about what happened in real life. For those of you who don't know, George R.R. Martin, a large part of his inspiration for the Song of Fire and Ice, so that's the Game of Thrones books, is from medieval politics. It's a War of the Roses, if for those of you who want to look that up. That is a large part of the inspiration. So in the episode, they take a closer look at what actually happened there. So again, a hugely popular show as well, and I very much recommend it. If you don't listen to it, give it a try and see if you like it. And I'm going to mention a final one, and that is called Heavy Hands. So it's a Heavy Hands podcast. That's basically a mixed martial arts podcast. Now, as I said in the beginning, I'm not really going to talk all that much about mixed martial arts on this podcast, because the focus is self-defense and martial arts in general. But that doesn't mean I don't listen to them. And I know that a lot of you listeners are MMA fans and are very much into that as well. So what's the Heavy Hand podcast? Well, it's a podcast where it's all about stand-up. Well, I'm exaggerating. Mostly about striking. So the stand-up, the punching, kicking, clinching on the feet and so on. And they just talk about different fighters, strategies, tactics, and so on. They do a bunch of predictions of upcoming events, and then they do an analysis after the event, right? So what did we get wrong? What can we learn? What did we see? And so on. So it's just asking a lot of questions and then trying to answer them. For instance, not the last one, but one before was about the latest big UFC event, where it was going to see if Cain Velasquez would be able to beat Francis Ngannou, or if, and I'm literally writing what's in the show notes here, is Cain Velasquez simply too broken down to make good on the obvious stylistic advantage he has over Francis Ngannou? Well, no, we know now that he's too broken down because his knee gave out. Is Paul Felder's best chance against James Vick to take him down? We know that now as well, how that played out. So I very much like the analytical part of that show, is where they just break down, right, okay, this is the kind of fighter that person is, these are the advantages, the disadvantages, and it comes clearly from people who have training in MMA. as opposed to people who are enthusiasts. There's a huge difference in the skill, well, not the skill, but in my opinion, value of an analysis from someone who actually trains and spars and fights and so on in MMA compared to somebody who just likes to see UFC events and see big burly guys beat each other up. I mean, just because you're enthusiastic doesn't mean that you know what you're talking about. So that's what I like a lot about the Heavy Hands podcast. It's just good, solid analysis, a bit of humor, obviously. And that was what I mentioned, is Patrick Wyman, the host of Tides of History, used to be the second person on the Heavy Hands podcast. So it's Connor Rubush, who is one of the hosts, and I think it's Phil McKenzie, who's the other one. If you go to the bloodyelbow.com website, which is an MMA portal, you'll see you'll see those guys writing articles as well. So I like that one a lot. It's a really interesting one. And again, if you're into MMA, I would give it a shot. You don't have to agree with everything they say, but the point of view that they present are quite interesting. I don't agree with everything they say on a technical level as well, but do you know one coach who agrees with every other coach out there? I mean, that's the thing about coaches in martial arts and gyms and so on, is that they have their own way of doing things and they don't necessarily agree with everybody else. So that's pretty much it for this episode. So I will put links to all these podcasts and stuff that I mentioned in the show notes, and then you can just go there and click on that. So that's wimsblog.com/29, and that way you can get all the content. As always, if you want to support the show, I would very much appreciate that. That would be great. Just go to patreon.com/Wim Demeere. And again, you can just starting with $1. You can support everything I do here, and obviously get access to a bunch of really cool content. And then finally, so announcing it already, as I mentioned throughout, a little bit before in the podcast, the next episode is going to be really awesome. I have Dr. Alexis Arthwal for about an hour and a half on the podcast. We already did an interview, and I will release it in about 2 weeks. In the next episode, she is going to give a lot of information about preparing for and handling lethal force encounters. So really, really good stuff, and I hope that you come check that out as well. In the meantime, have a great day, and I will talk to you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Wim Demeere podcast. For more information, go to www.wimsblog.com.